Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location. This is Brooke Akins, and on behalf of Q1 Productions and Vaz Advisors, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar and thank you for joining us. Today's webinar will focus on diversity and inclusion and include perspectives from advocacy groups and biopharmaceutical companies. We'd like to thank Vaz Advisors again for sponsoring today's webinar discussion. And we're very lucky to have Dr. Tim Turnham, who's the Vice President of Client Services at Vaz Advisors, with us today. And he'll be leading today's discussion on increasing diversity and inclusion in the drug development process with our featured panelists. Please note that a copy of today's presentation recording will be sent to all registered attendees. And we have left a few minutes at the end of today's discussion for your questions. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation via the Q&A feature on your toolbar. Again, feel free to send these through at any time during the discussion, and I do encourage you to be as specific as possible. Please feel free to include an example to better assist our panelists in thoroughly answering your questions. And again, we've saved about 5 minutes at the end for Q&A. But without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce our moderator for today. Again, Tim Turnham at Vaz Advisors. Tim has a record of success in finding mutually beneficial connections in industry, patients, and patient advocacy groups. This led him to join the Vaz team in 2017 after decades in the nonprofit sector. He was the CEO of the Colon Cancer Alliance and most recently the executive director of the Melanoma Research Foundation. He's built broad perspectives by listening to patients and care partners and helping give a voice to their experiences. His priority then and now is to maximize the insight and value that multiple stakeholders can achieve through collaboration. This, Tim believes, allows better drugs to be brought to the market faster. I'm going to hand it over again to Dr. Tim Turnham, who's the Vice President of Client Services at Vaz Advisors.
Thank you for joining us for this webinar on diversity and inclusiveness in the drug development process. We have a fantastic panel who have a lot of ideas in this area and a lot of opinions, and we hope to have a robust and dynamic conversation on this important topic. I will ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and I've asked each of them also to give one example that gives them hope that we will see progress in this field. While they're thinking about that, a few ground rules. We do have a mixed panel. I think we'll have a lot of different opinions. I think we all kind of know the obvious parts of this conversation. We also want to make this work. Everybody involved in this wants to make this work, wants to make this better. We know we won't solve all the problems in one short webinar, but I hope that we will come away with some tangible, specific action items that'll help each of us take steps that can make progress. If we can make progress and keep the progress growing, then this is a positive thing. So again, thank you for joining us. And I will now ask our panelists to introduce themselves by giving their name, their association, and that one example that gives them hope. And Andrea, I'll start with you.
Okay, my name is Andrea Maddox-Smith. I'm the CEO with the Bladder Cancer Advocacy Network, which we affectionately refer to as Beacon. What gives me hope is that a lot of what happened in the summer of 2020 and some of the challenges we had as a country, and people are starting to recognize that things really need to change. And I see people are open, you know, in the healthcare industry. They are open to looking at things differently. So that makes me hopeful.
Thank you, Andrea. And Sonali?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sonali Chopra. I lead the Patient Advocacy Relations team at Genentech. And I feel very privileged to work with the advocates in this particular panel. So Andrea and Stephanie. Yeah. I feel a lot of hope today. And, you know, the one example that came to mind, Tim, when you asked that question is we embarked on a trial called Impacta last year, looking at Actemra and COVID patients. Specifically in minorities, and we enrolled 377 patients, and 84% of them were from underserved communities. And it was actually a trial that we enrolled in one of the fastest times. So it also debunks the myth that if you do inclusive research, it's going to take more time.
That's a great point, Sonali. This is something I wanted to talk about later, so you've answered the question. I love that with a perfect example. Okay, Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Monroe. I am with Us Against Alzheimer's, a patient advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. I, in particular, lead our diversity and inclusion work and also lead our African American Network Against Alzheimer's. I guess the thing I'm most hopeful about is the fact that we're having these kinds of conversations. We've been writing and thinking and talking about this sort of undercover for quite some time. And now that it's sort of being brought out in the open, we have the opportunity to make some real forward and intentional movement and progress in this space. So I'm very excited about that.
Thank you. And Tricia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Tricia Mullins. I am the Global Head of Patient Advocacy at Atara Bio. And really, I am hopeful right now, and every of my colleagues said that it's really a time of change, and including a diverse population should be at the forefront of everything we do, from clinical trials, preclinical, to commercialization. So living and breathing that and keeping the diverse population front and center and bringing that to the entire company and culture.
Thank you. I think when we talk about difficult topics like this, it's good to begin with hope, but we also don't want to be naive. I mean, we all recognize that many challenges exist, many problems exist. There's still a lot of work to be done in this area. And I guess one thing that strikes me as we think about diversity and inclusiveness, I listened to the four of you talk, and then many others also working in this space, and everyone wants to make it work. You know, we want to make this work. So if that's the case, why is it so hard? Why are we still talking about this? I mean, we've been talking about this for years. Why hasn't this been put to bed and done, right? And so to help kind of shape that discussion a little bit, I want to ask Andrea and Stephanie first. Are there things that advocates know or see that companies may not understand or may not recognize that would help inform this discussion? And I'll let either one of you go first, whoever wants to go.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think one of the things that we've seen, and frankly, I've been in this work now for about 10 years, and it really surprised me, all of the myths and I guess we call them now intrinsic biases against asking populations to participate. It was almost as if we were afraid of the answer. And if that answer was yes, we wouldn't know what to do next. So being very wary or afraid, or frankly, because of past atrocities like Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks, I think some shame attached with asking a community, will you help us with this important work that actually could help save your lives, your family lives, and your community lives. So I think that was part of the problem. And again, being afraid that people would say either yes and what to do, how hard it would be to keep them enrolled, but also the presumption, I think, that many people would say no, when in fact we debunked that myth right away. And we found that about 80% of folks, when we were down at the community level as a trusted provider of information and had the right kind of messaging and the right timing and the right partners, we could get on average about 80% of folks to say, yes, I want to be involved in this. And then what happens with them as in terms of inclusion and exclusion is another matter, but there is certainly a willingness and an interest to be engaged.
Well, I'm right there with Stephanie, because the first thing I thought of when you asked that question, I was thinking really it's just the unconscious bias and just making the assumption that when the person walks in, there's not going to be that interest. And like Stephanie, I agree, 9 times out of 10, people are very interested, but it's because of some of the things that have happened in the past. Like she said, I was thinking the very same thing with Tuskegee. People automatically assume certain races don't necessarily want to be involved, and that's certainly not the case.
And Andrea, I think it's interesting you and Stephanie both use the phrase unconscious bias, because in our prep call when we were talking earlier, I used that term and got called out on it, saying by using unconscious bias, we may be undervaluing what's really going on, underselling the impact of what's really going on, because sometimes it's not unconscious bias, it's just bias. It's just mistaken belief, right? It's just out there. I'm not going to talk to Black folks about coming into clinical trials because they're not going to enroll. You know,
Yeah.
that's not unconscious. That's a conscious decision that people
Yeah.
make.
Yeah.
And
Oh, that's not a bad point, but you know, I still use it. Unconscious.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good role, but I think,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
one of
Good
the things
point.
I love that you're saying is that, you know, that we're talking about this now, and if we're going to talk about it honestly and frankly, I think that was a good reminder for us. So Tricia and Sonali, from your side, what internal challenges do companies face that may not be apparent to advocates or to patient populations that could challenge the efforts to increase inclusivity and diversity?
Sure, I can bite on that. And I want to give Stephanie a chance too, if she wanted to add in there. I think at the heart of it is, you know, human beings are creatures of habit, and human beings are the ones running these studies. Human beings are the ones deciding where the studies are. Human beings are the ones asking other human beings if they want to take part in the study. And when you're a study team and you're trying to get that study enrolled so that you can get results, you're trying to move as fast as you can. And what the fastest and easiest and habitual thing to do is to go to the sites that you've always gone to, your Memorial Sloan Ketterings, your MD Andersons, where, let's face it, there's a certain population that has access and can afford to go to those places.
Yep.
And then those doctors within those institutions, incredibly well-meaning, are going to ask the people that they think most likely will say yes, and that they'll have to spend the least amount of time explaining it to. And so what you get is bias over bias over bias, and you end up with a teeny tiny population. And when we look at the numbers, you know, it's very clear most of our trial participants are white. So I think it comes down to the fact that we are incentivized as an industry to move quickly and to get the trial enrolled so that most patients can benefit from it. And from a regulatory standpoint, we're neither incentivized nor penalized to actually include the representative demographics of that disease.
Tricia, your thoughts?
Well, Sonali did a great job. I think that's at the forefront of everything that we do. You know, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to removing these barriers, and we are human beings. And we go to, Andrea, we discussed this, the usual suspects of KOLs. And I think we really need to make a more conservative and conscious effort to go to the community. And I don't know what that looks like, but I know there's mentorships and collaboration between KOLs and centers and community doctors, but maybe we really need to encourage that. And then also encourage the tracking of diverse populations in the trials and making sure that that's part of, you know, our vernacular, our language. And I really think, you know, meeting where patients where they're at is in the community, and not just necessarily the Memorial Sloan Ketterings of the world.
So
one of the
go ahead, Andrea.
I was going to say, one of the things we discussed before, Tricia and I, is really ensuring that the process is and making it intentional. And so if you include that in there, and you know, because she's absolutely right, everyone they'll go to the Sloan Ketterings, you know, they'll go to Johns Hopkins, they'll go where they know, especially if there's a time limit, you have to get a certain number of people. But if you make it intentional and you ensure that a certain number of people are of color, that sort of thing, they're going to have to go to some other places to get them. And so if you make that process more intentional, I certainly believe it will help.
And I think the other thing that's very, you know, that's been a challenge for industry is understanding, because of the time pressure. Number one, understanding the amount of time that it takes to forge these relationships with communities who have a bias against you. They know that you're coming to them wanting something. You haven't really been present in their communities giving them something. It's always been with a string attached. And so the communities are looking for authentic entities that really want to be not just physically in the community, but really embedded in the community and meeting their needs where they are, and not attempting to pull them away from trusted medical providers that they've been going to for years. So creating authentic partnerships, which really also involves, you know, some reward for those providers or incentives for these providers to work with
Right.
you is really important. Because that's the person that, even if you convince them they should be in a clinical trial or a study, they're going to go back to their doctor and ask him, do you think this is a good idea? And if he says no, or if he says, I'm not familiar with those people, or they don't treat Sister Sue right, you've hit a big wall. So you've got to work hard and very intentionally, but respecting where people already go, and also having a greater understanding of how they like to receive their information. I think a lot of people think, oh, we'll just throw up an ad on the side of a bus, as if everyone's riding a bus, and that somehow people are on the bus with their memo pad and they're going to write down your 1-800 number.
Right.
Put
That
a
doesn't
flyer
work.
in the barber shop, right? Put a flyer in the barber shop to go fix it all.
Or beauty shops, right.
From the beauty shop. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Right.
I mean, it sounds like what we're talking about is either A, adding some requirements on the current PIs who are kind of the usual suspects to say, look, we want you on this study, but you've got to recruit a different kind of population.
Right.
Or B, or maybe it's both of these, finding new PIs that are working in those communities. And if it is the latter, I wonder, is there an opportunity for collaboration between industry and patient advocacy groups to identify who those trusted voices are, and to kind of build the connections to those people that would enable them then to be involved in future studies?
Yeah, we recently have been working on an initiative where we ask study teams to come to the patient advocacy team within Genentech and have our patient advocacy groups vet the sites. So take a look at the sites, give us any feedback on our list, and then more importantly, add in sites that they may have relationships with that they know are reaching certain patients, and giving that to us so that we can start to forge new relationships.
Right.
I think that's super important. From protocol design to, continuing creating materials, is it really in patient-friendly language? Does it make it sense? Is it culturally sensitive? Are we really putting all the information out there? We're updating our patient tab on the website. We've had 10 patients look at it already, and this is rounds, just pre-concepts. So I think it's important that, we're speaking the language that is understandable, but not dumbing it down, making sure that it's relatable. And it's the information they need. So I couldn't agree more.
Right.
So one topic that's come up a couple of times, and actually a couple of topics that are related, but the concept of trust and what that spills over a little bit to me is about relationships. And I think, Stephanie, you talked about doing the hard work, because you don't build trust and you don't establish a relationship by putting a poster on the side of a bus, and you
right.
don't do it by dipping into a community for a week or a month or 6 months, and then going away and disappearing until the next time you need something.
That's right.
So I'm wondering, how important is it to reaching out to the right people, and what is the best way to reach out? How important is it to make a long-term commitment and to have, a multi-year relationship that gets built? And I'm curious what barriers might exist that would keep companies from doing this.
Well, I'd love to answer part of this question. And
yeah, I asked like 17 questions.
I know, there was great. I think one of the first things that needs to happen is a little bit of self-examination. And before you reach out, you could have the best messages, the glossiest pamphlets, good community assets that you can tap into, and then you send the wrong person into the field and it's all for naught. So identifying, look at who your employees are. Who is your outreach team? If a person comes into your site for clinical research to get a blood draw, what are they going to see when they come in there?
Right.
I've often said to people, and it's a little crass, but there are some sites you go to and the only African American or Latino person you see is pushing a broom. It doesn't matter what you're saying after that. Are you making an effort to make sure that you have a diverse team,
right,
and that you have created a diverse pipeline? I'm going to use a cheat sheet for a second and just share what I thought was a surprising statistic. So African Americans are 13% of the population, but represent only 7% of people coming out of medical school, and only 1% of professors. Latinos are 16% of the population, only have 9% of folks who are graduating are Latino and only represent 3% of professors. And that has a lot to do with, of course, the research enterprise as well. We're seeing those same type of startling statistics. So we've got to figure out a better way to tap into the pipeline. And it certainly is not because there's a lack of talent out there. We have to be really intentional where the talent is, partnering with historic Black and historic Hispanic serving institutions,
Right.
Recruiting in traditional institutions, but really making an effort to form mentoring partnerships, apprenticeships, just to let people rise to their full potential and see research as a great occupation for them and a great social service. And then as we begin to filter that into research, and hopefully we'll have, at every level of a career ladder, you'll see some good representation of people. We know that as a result of that, research studies have better quality. Those folks are actually more inclined to consider, being more aggressive in terms of diversity. And it enriches the conversation about why this is really important. It's not just, because we want to be politically correct. There's actually scientific rigor that demands that we have to produce diverse trials so that we make sure that therapeutics and strategies work for all of us.
I'm thinking, if I were sitting as a representative of a pharmaceutical or biotech company, I would say, gee, it's not really our responsibility to diversify the population of people in medical school. It's not really our responsibility to diversify the group of people who are pursuing PhDs in the biosciences. So is that a legitimate, Sonali, Tricia,
No.
is that a legitimate?
No, it's not.
Or am I completely off base here? Yeah.
No, it's not. And we are actually doing just that. We've invested in a program called Kindergarten to Careers, where we are looking at our backyard, which is South San Francisco, which has a large population of underserved people. And we're investing starting in kindergarten to get them interested in science, to get them interested in STEAM, to really open up our campus when we were open and had a lab there where we would have students come and actually meet with researchers and do laboratory experiments. And then we've actually partnered with professional societies and advocacy groups to do scholarships and grant programs to really target and look at minorities coming up through medical school into residency. Neurology has one of the most underrepresented African Americans. I believe it's 2% of neurologists are African Americans. So how do we, and we're talking to AAN right now about how do we increase that number? So for us, as part of our commitment to health equity and inclusion, one of our pillars is transforming society. It's not just about our internal employees. It's not just about healthcare. It's about how can you transform society and create representation, in every facet.
Yeah, Tricia, I'm thinking, a smaller company, maybe even a startup company, they don't have the resources to do something like that. What can be done at that level, I wonder, to address this issue?
No, and I think that sounds like a great program, Sonali. I love it. It's like, treating everyone. And I think I applaud you and Genentech for that. So great. I think from a small company perspective, what we're doing at Atara is really trying to disrupt exclusionary behavior. We're doing a lot of education also with hiring, making sure that we're hiring diverse populations, employees that also can go out into the fields, that can interact, whether, in the community, and making sure it stays relevant. So I think from there, it's also listening to the patient communities. I know, Andrea, we talked about it, but trust is, going back to that is the number one factor. You have to build a relationship. I've worked in rare diseases for numerous years, and you start to finish, and you even, programs where we didn't continue with the drug, we've continued the relationship in non-transactional ways, but how can we still assist? And I think
that's important. Yeah, that's important.
And we all know it takes a long time to earn trust and a second to lose it. So
yeah, absolutely.
Andrea, when we were talking earlier, you gave an example that wasn't related to inclusiveness and diversity, but was around patient centricity, but may have some carryover into this space. You talked about meeting a chief patient officer And you tell the story. Because
Well,
I think there are lessons that we can learn on this topic.
One of the points I was making is, and that's not every company, but there are a lot of companies they're putting in, they have the buzzwords. Right now they have the position of chief patient officer, but they've also been patient centric and this and that. But you go into a company and you're meeting with an entire marketing staff, they've never even met a patient. So that was one of the points that I was making, not necessarily the buzzwords, but, really walking it like you're talking it. I like what Tricia had to say is even when the drug isn't there, you really have to still stay involved with those communities. It's really important. And the other point that I wanted to make is it's important that when you're building these things, I tell people all the time, stop building it thinking they're going to come. You have got to involve them in the process. They're not just going to come because they trust you. You have to involve them before you expect them to come. They have to be at the table in the beginning. It's so important.
I heard years ago about a university that built a new building and they didn't build any sidewalks leading to the building. They waited until people had worn paths in the grass, and then they built the sidewalks where the people had been walking.
Yeah.
And I thought there's something to be said there, that we want to build structures that fit our conceived notions of what are going on. But if we listen to people, watch what they're doing, see where they're living, and get engaged at that level, we have something that works better for everyone.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think that's really interesting. So let me ask this and change the topic just a little bit. This global pandemic we've been living in has reshaped everything. And
absolutely,
you referenced a clinical trial in the COVID era earlier, but it's this restructuring that has been forced upon the whole system, including how clinical trials are done. Is this restructuring an opportunity to bring about some systemic change that can help address some of these issues around representation and inclusiveness? I'm thinking even just how if you can have people in a trial that's with more virtual connections or more in-home visits or more wearables, instead of having them travel to the holy shrine of the best and the brightest people to participate in this study. If you can do that in COVID, why can't you do it all the time and increase accessibility? Are there some things we can learn that can help in the diversity and inclusiveness effort?
Mm-hmm.
I think the answer to that is yes. There are some very effective processes that we've learned how to make available to patients. I guess the thing I will be interested to see, though, is how has this impacted minority communities, which many times don't have access to cell towers and Wi-Fi. People in rural communities, I'm not going to say it's just minority communities.
Right.
But have they been put, sometimes progress will leave us behind if we're not really ready to go with it. And so I know that because of some of our advocacy work that we do in Washington, there were some very strong efforts to make sure that we built in place the infrastructure that was needed to make sure these communities had a good opportunity to connect with that. I guess the proof will be in the pudding if we see how that has panned out in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think this concept of the digital divide is really being showcased during the pandemic. And I'll just tell a quick story about what happened here in San Francisco that I think really demonstrates that. When they first were launching the vaccine, they created a specific access code that you could put into the appointment site. And they gave those access codes to different underserved populations via groups and other ways. Those access codes got into the hands of non-underserved individuals, and oftentimes actually very tech-savvy, wealthy individuals in San Francisco. Those codes were used by wealthy individuals, and the populations that actually were trying to be targeted by that weren't able to get the vaccine because they ran out. But what they did with that, they learned their mistake, and they actually just started creating flyers in Spanish, flyers in certain neighborhoods of San Francisco that have highly underserved populations. They purposely did not advertise these sites on the internet. They didn't have it as part of myturn.california.gov where you could get all the vaccination sites. And they just did grassroots marketing. And they literally had people text their friends and say, do you have someone that you know that lives in this zip code? And they only did their marketing that way. And now our neighborhoods in San Francisco that have the most underserved populations actually have a higher rate of vaccination previous. So I think for us, we really have to think about internet access, because that is not the solve for people. And as Stephanie mentioned, we are going to leave a lot of people behind if we think that decentralization and virtual visits and telemedicine is going to solve all this, because there are people who will not have access to that, and there'll be an even bigger gap.
That's right.
So one of the things we've learned in the COVID time is you can do webinars virtually, right? You can do advisory boards virtually. Is this an opportunity to bring more diversity into patient advisory boards? So if they're weighing in on a protocol, because one of the things that's been a challenge in the past is we bring together patients in a location. What often happens during the week, if you have a job where you're paid by the hour, or where you can't take a day vacation, then you can never have that voice at that table.
Right.
But maybe there's a different way of doing things now.
Yeah, I certainly believe that things are never going to go back to exactly how they were before. I think this is really what's happened with COVID is really allowing people to think very differently about that type of thing. So I've seen a lot more advisory boards, and including people that we've never been able to get out because of the reasons you're talking about right now. They hadn't been able to leave work for 1 or 2 days, even though they might have been getting compensated a little bit. And so we've been able to involve far more people than we've ever been before in just advisory boards. So, and I mean patients.
Yeah, I think too, I agree with you, Andrea. You know, the COVID world has changed. You know, everything I feel will have a hybrid version, something that will be digital. And I think that does also help, you know, for those that do have access, but also for those that are have disabilities, dealing with traveling, you know, whether it's a rare disease, a chronic disease, it's a tool in the body, flying. And then if you need assisted devices, a wheelchair, you know, this is something that requires a lot of effort and time. And I think having this remote portion of ad boards and collectively, you know, doodle polls of what's the best time for you, you know, and kind of capturing feedback that way, as opposed to we're going to do it on Tuesday at 2.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Very, very interesting.
And then also allocating resources, you know, for clinical trials, like thinking about the transportation, you know, where is the transportation? Where's the site? Are we making sure that this information is being communicated to the communities, and especially via the patient organizations?
Yeah.
Right.
I think one of the lessons that we've also learned is the importance, again, of engaging communities where they are with who they receive their current healthcare from. So community health clinics in particular have been a great resource of COVID, and they do a fantastic job at managing a lot of the comorbidities that patients are dealing with at one location. And so a lot of the vaccines have been distributed through federally qualified health centers. There certainly are places, again, that we haven't really utilized as an in-community basis to be able to go in and do broad, blood draws and things like that don't require you to leave your community to go to a large academic center, but serving them in the communities where they're familiar with and where there's trust that's already been established. So I hope that's a lesson that we will learn, and that we will extend the capacity of that wonderful system that exists in almost every community.
And I think, Andrea, to your point, things will not go back to the way they were, but how far they go back to the way they were is yet to be determined. And can we actually take the momentum that COVID has forced upon the system and keep that moving in these important ways around diversity and inclusiveness? And where is the voice of the patient advocacy groups in ensuring that happens? Where is the drive from within biopharmaceutical companies to make sure that happens? And quite frankly, where are the regulators on this?
Right.
Because one of the big issues around moving more toward virtual experiences like this has been the regulatory environment. And so are the regulators going to say, yeah, we've seen that trials can work in a different way, and let's keep moving. And I would to see if that that flexibility can carry through. So I want to ask you to switch hats now a little bit, and I'll start with Tricia, and then you, Sonali, and then we're going to switch to our advocates after that. But So Tricia and Sonali, you work within the industry now in a company. So imagine if you were to quit work today and go to work at a patient advocacy organization. And you're working in this organization, you notice that the clinical trials and the ad boards and all of these things tend to be monolithic. It's the same usual suspects. There's no diversity, no inclusiveness. What would you do as a person in a patient advocacy group to help bring about change? This is a completely unfair question, but we're just talking here, okay?
Well, I actually worked for a nonprofit rare disease umbrella organization for 1 year. So,
well, that's not fair. Okay,
but I think it's important to bring to light when you wear that hat, you have to partner with industry and you have to bring in the needs of the community. And this specifically was for working with over 350 rare disease patient communities. So it was a lot, but it's really being specific to what that community needs. And how do we look at things differently? I mentioned the usual suspects. So how do, whether that's patients, whether that's KOLs, really making sure we are expanding our net in terms of who we're talking to, who we're reaching, and also providing that, you mentioned about patient organizations, totally would, partner with biotech in terms of who are the treaters in this, ultra rare disease and who do we see, and vice versa. So how do we make it a collaborative discussion? And then from diversity standpoint is making sure that it's all inclusive and, working with so many different rare diseases, it was sharing collateral, sharing materials, sharing best practices. And that's something I think industry should be able to do more of as well.
Yeah, Tricia, I would love that if we could share more. We've got some pesky rules that prevent us from doing that sometimes. If I worked for a group, I think one of the first things I would do is, if it isn't already available, really understand that disease demographically and know it deeply, whether it's bladder cancer or Alzheimer's, what are the demographics of that disease? And then I would look internally first. Does our staff represent the demographics of that disease? The people on our scientific advisory board and our board of directors, do they mirror that? Yeah. And I would want to be able to say yes to all of that. And then I would go to my industry partners and say, hey, these are the demographics. We've taken the work to make sure that it looks like that on our end. And we want to make sure that every advisory board, every study, everything is also mirroring that. And we'll gladly participate when we see that. And when we don't, we're going to ask some questions.
Yeah.
Accountability.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then for Andrea and then Stephanie, imagine that you quit your work and went to work for a pharmaceutical company. And so now you're part of the company, and part of your remit is to help increase diversity in clinical trials, right? That's part of what your job is to do that. How would you go about doing that? What would you do first?
I'll tell you what I would do first. If you don't mind, Stephanie, I'll go first. I would certainly increase my visibility in the communities. I mean, the large cancer centers, I'll tell you, they're getting what they need. It's on the community level where they are not. So I would really make a point to target the communities and work a lot more with community, in my case, community urologists and things like that. That's what I would point to first, because I think that's where the need is. Large urban centers, even rural areas, things like that. That's what I would do.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think for me, I think the answer is also the same as what was discussed on the industry side. But I would want to work on additional transparency and accountability, making sure that, it's very difficult to change culture. You need strong leadership. And I would want to look at ways that we are bringing in and turning over that leadership to make sure that, again, we are creating good pathways to people inside, maybe create even community ombudsmen who are embedded inside the organization, who then are your voices like ambassadors outside as well. But transparency in terms of how drugs are made. How do you all make a decision about what drug to make or what symptom you're treating? Are you asking patients what they need? What symptom are they most interested in you finding a remedy to address, instead of figuring out on the marketing side maybe first, but asking patients what they really need. And then holding yourself accountable. You know, what happens if you set hopefully an aggressive goal to recruit and enroll a certain percentage of patients in the trial, and you don't meet that target? What do? Do you let the drug go to market, or do you hold it out until you've reached that target? So what you do with those, you know, that intention, I think is really going to be important. I don't have the answer. But I think having that strong conversation about what do we do with this if we fail, despite best efforts, if you really are putting forth best efforts, what do we do with that?
Yeah. And the only other thing I would say, if you don't mind, is I would really, I'm not sure what position you're talking about, but I would really work with changing the culture from the top down, because I think it's really important that everyone in an organization is speaking a language. If you're truly committed to something like this, it's not just the marketing department and the advocacy department that could be carrying this message. It has to be everyone in the organization carrying this message, from the boardroom all the way down.
So that's an interesting point that segues into, I had a couple of very, very quick questions that I don't think require a lot of discussion, but I'm really interested in your opinion about this. Should companies have, as part of their key performance indicators or KPIs, by which you evaluate people where it's appropriate, that they're demonstrating diversity and inclusiveness? So if you're a head of a program for a clinical trial program, and your clinical trial accrual does not represent the demographics of the patient population, then you get a ding on your performance evaluation, because that kind of comes right. You want to talk about incentives, that comes down to whether you get promoted, whether you can advance in the company, whether you get a bonus, all of those things.
The short answer is yes. Yes, all the above. Yeah.
I can see, I think Sonali and Tricia, you're like, it's hard, right? I mean, that's a hard, but let me flip it around the other way. Should companies only sponsor and support patient advocacy groups whose staff and boards and scientific advisory committees reflect the demographics of the patient population?
So I think with both of your questions, I think it would be ideal to get there with both of them. I think where we are right now, realistically, is so far from that, that to have such a heavy penalty or even such a heavy reward might be a step too far today in 2021. But I'll say that on your first question, we just released our annual D&I report, and Stephanie is in that. And we actually made a pledge by 2025 that every single study molecule team will have a population plan to understand their population of that disease. And every single study will have an inclusive research plan. And I think you have to start somewhere. You have to start with first understanding the problem, understanding the data, understanding the demographics. And I think we could get to a place where that's a requirement, and your drug may not even get approved, or you're not going to get promoted, or all of those things. But I think right now we do have to take some steps to get there.
And I agree with that. And I think I don't think the advocacy community can claim that they've been successful in making sure that there's the kind of diversity that we would like to see, even among our midst. I think it's an issue that we all have to work hard on and not make excuses about it. I will say, though, that I think we've made a great deal of progress, because we've been talking just about race and ethnicity. The other part of diversity is women. And I think we've made some great progress in elevating the status of women.
Gender,
and gender. I think those are really important as well. So I think we can give ourselves all a little bit of pat. In fact, since we have 4 women on this call, I think says congratulations.
Says it all, right.
But it should never be enough. It should never be enough.
Right.
No, I worked in a medical research lab 40 years ago, and I saw the way women, even women who were postdocs and things like that, were just treated like trash. I mean, they were treated horribly by the men in the patriarchal environment. And I've talked to many women in research, lately, and seen price. Look, we're not there yet, but the progress is encouraging. Okay, we've got just a couple more things to do, and not a whole lot of time in which to do it. It seems to me that some of the things we've heard over and over again is that trust is vital, that building relationships is really critical, and this kind of means being present, and not just as a drop-in, drop-out piece, but really being present. It takes time and consistency, showing actions that back up your words. And having accountability on both sides, holding each other accountable and ourselves accountable are all some kind of core principles that are important in this conversation. So based on all the things that we've talked about, I would like for each of you to offer to the people who are listening to the webinar one kind of specific thing, one specific activity that they could do that could help make progress in this space. And I think, Sonali, your point is really well taken, that some things are a step too far. I like throwing out steps too far because hopefully it makes us think about where we can go. But you're not going to get there today or tomorrow. So let's think about what can be done in the next month or the next couple of months by people who may be listening to this webinar to help make progress in this area. So who wants to go first?
I'll go first. Oh,
Oh, all four of you want to go first. I love this. This is great.
okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Stephanie.
I'll say that I think that I would love to see people actually take steps in the communities where they are the most uncomfortable, and see where those communities are and lay eyes on the people and maybe have some conversation with people you wouldn't ordinarily be with.
Yeah. Yeah.
And do you think that people in your kind of position, Stephanie, in advocacy groups would be interested in going with people from companies to do that? To take that step together, say, here's where you need to go, here's where you need to talk to, let's go together and do that.
I think people should take some individual responsibility here. Actually.
Okay. All right.
I don't think you need a guide to go to Compton. You just do it.
That's fair.
And I think, I think it's a safe place, and that you should allow yourself to feel a little bit uncomfortable, because they probably feel as uncomfortable seeing you in their community as you feel being there. But you've got it one step at a time. And that's what it is. I think literally when I go out and do community events, before I go and have a meeting with people who are decision makers, I actually do go into the community just to drive around, see who's there, the condition of the housing, all of these other social determinants of health that you're only going to see when you lay eyes on things. So for me, that always helps me center myself in terms of who I'm trying to reach.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Who wants to go next?
I'll go after Stephanie, because I was going to say some of the same thing as far as engaging in the community. But other than that, the one thing I would say is really, as much as possible, involving the patient. You have to get them in there. You have to meet. You have to be working with them one-on-one. I just feel that's very important. You got to do it.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. All right, Sonali or Tricia, either one.
I think that was great advice, Stephanie, too, about, seeing your surroundings, go into the community. I think in the past, I've maybe not, I did it, but not consciously. I would just, kind of see the area before, but really going in mindfully to do an assessment of that. I think that's important. But I really think it's the meaningful involvement of patients, caregivers, the patient organizations, and the intent. And I think, as we build this partnership, and it's so important. And I think the fact we're having this conversation right now, very calmly, and we have differences of opinions and collaboration perhaps, but, really addressing the unconscious bias as well as we move forward, and how do we really make our trials more inclusive to diverse communities. It will be imperative. And I like the idea of making sure there's a little tracker on the trials. And I love what you're doing, Sonali, with that as well. So I think that's great.
Thanks. Yeah, I love all these suggestions. I got sent to me a little exercise called a self-assessment on your inner circle. And it's got like room for 8 names of like people that you really trust. And then it's got across the top, you know, organization, gender, ethnicity, race, religion, all these different characteristics. And I thought, wouldn't that be great if you could take that type of worksheet for a trial? You know, we're talking about how to increase minorities in clinical trials. What if you took that and you looked at who your key inputs are for your trial? Who's on your advisory committee? Who are you running your protocol by? What do your sites look like? Like, what if you set up that worksheet and really said, and then you looked at it, and if all the ethnicities were one thing, or all the organizations were one thing, we're talking about patient involvement, they're all HCPs, and really kind of look at, are you talking to a diverse set of stakeholders in informing and creating that trial? If everything looks the same on that worksheet, you know, you might not be, and you've got to get a patient group in there, you know, get an underrepresented, you know, person on your steering committee to really start to listen to other thoughts.
Very good. I think these are all really good, solid, tangible things that anyone listening could take on and do very quickly, and really could make the difference in the way you look at things, the way you do things. This is really great. Been a wonderful discussion. Any last words? Anything that we've missed that you wish we'd talked about? Any other observation or comment? I mean, when I say anything we've missed, we could have spent a week on this. All right, I get that. But is there anything else that's just burning that you feel like needs to be said?
The one thing I did want to mention.
I was waiting,
I
Andrea.
count on you, Andrea. I love it.
No. We've talked about a lot, and we certainly, I believe, we got the, you know, the race in there when you're looking at diversity. But I really think it's important too that when we're looking, any organization is looking at diversity, they really should be looking at geographic, socioeconomic. We've talked about the gender diversity, but that socioeconomic, that's a real issue.
Yes.
And we have to pay attention to that. And normally they're coming hand in hand with the race and the socioeconomic, but we have to do that. We absolutely have to do that.
I think that's a great point. And I was just gonna say, don't underestimate your power, whether you're, you know, a person who works for a patient advocacy group, you're a patient advocacy person within the industry. It just takes one person to speak up and call out something. It doesn't matter who you are. So if you're, you know, passionate about this issue, it doesn't matter if you don't work in clinical development, you know, raise your hand and say something.
Yeah. See something, say something.
Well, one of the things, I'm sorry, first, anything else, Stephanie, Tricia, from you before we close out? No? I just want to say, you know, I do think we're working in a space where we do think about ourselves of some, you know, we want to self-reflect, we want to grow. And so we want to think about what are our own areas in which we need to work and things like that. But there are times when we need to break out of that and to use a word that some of you have used in our previous conversations. And I think it's so stark, is we have to actually be anti-racist. It's not just enough to work on ourselves. We also have to be vocal. When we do see something, we have to speak out against it, even if it makes us uncomfortable, even if it's family, even if it's neighbors, even if it's a stranger on the corner of the street. And that changes the way you engage with the world, I think. If you make a commitment to do that, if you know ahead of time, even if it's my colleague at work, even if it's somebody who's above me at work, these are things we have to call out. And this has really been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank all of you, not only for a really robust discussion, but for the work that you are doing in each of your places where you're working to make the world of the drug development space more diverse, more inclusive, and ultimately better for everyone. I really believe if we can find ways to make progress in this area, we'll get better drugs out to more people and have better outcomes across the board. So thank you for that, and we'll keep the work going.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much to our lovely panel, who I'm going to welcome to turn on their cameras and join us now for our live discussion. See you joining us there. Thank you so much. We do have time for Q&A, and thank you again to our attendees for submitting your questions to us. Tim, welcome. Tricia, welcome. Let me just pull up Q&A here so we can jump in whenever we're ready. We've got quite a few questions here, and I know just a couple minutes. So why don't I jump into the first question that was submitted? But again, echoing Tim's statement on just a wonderful, lovely, thought-provoking discussion with all of our panelists. Thank you to you. First question that came through here, for good reason, there has been skepticism, fear, and disinterest around trial participation among some communities, as our panelists discuss. This attendee is curious if the publicity around the COVID vaccine development has impacted thoughts and views on trial participation. I'd welcome any of our panelists to share thoughts on that.
So I have some thoughts, but Tricia, I'd love to hear your thoughts first, and I'll build on that maybe.
Yeah, no, I think we see, and Andrea touched on it with Tuskegee, obviously, but I think relative to COVID, I think we've seen the accelerated approval process. I think we, availability for that. I haven't really thought about it in terms of the trials and participation for COVID vaccines, how it will reflect personally on, clinical trials that we're working on. Tim, I don't know what your perspective is.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. We've heard about people who are resisting vaccination and the skepticism that they have. We've heard about people who expressed concern when the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was halted and issues around that. I think for those people, it'll reinforce their bias to be skeptical of research. But I think more broadly than that, on a much more positive note, we had so much discussion about the importance of these trials. And this trial is at this stage, and we got these people in this trials, and now we're doing a study for younger patients and things like that. I think it's helped maybe remove some of the myths and the concerns about clinical trials, that this is not about being a guinea pig. This is about helping get better drugs out there for everybody. The trials are what allowed these vaccines to be possible. The vaccines are what allowing people to begin to visit with their friends and family and go out to eat and do the things they want to do again. I think it's going to generate more interest in trials.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we did see, especially how quickly this process has been for the rare disease community, how this process could speed up clinical trials for the greater rare disease community as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Another fantastic question. With the increased focus on diversity and inclusion, will thought leaders feel inundated with too many organizations or companies trying to vie for their time and collaboration? How best can we make sure we can make progress without bogging down the process and overburdening leaders in communities?
Yeah, this is already an issue to some extent because, with the FDA's focus on patient-focused drug development, the EMA's work on including the patient voice, we're seeing the same thing in Japan, their patient burst program. It's a little not quite as far developed as it is here, but particularly I think, Tricia, as you know, in the rare disease space, you may only have one or two people who are really out there leading the community to some extent. And now you may have 5 companies that are all wanting to talk to them and getting their point of view. And now you add on this other layer of diversity. Yeah, I think it could be a challenge. This is why the more we can do things collaboratively, the better. I think across the board, we have to find ways to collaborate to make sure that we're getting the right points of view. But the other thing is, maybe moving beyond the thought leaders. I think we are still not listening to people who are representative of the patient population. So let's go a little deeper and not go to the person who shows up at all of the fora and not go to the person who's on all the panels, but find that person who may not even be on the internet and hear what they have to say.
I agree with that. When I worked in hepatitis C, it was interesting. It was really going into rural communities and meeting with, say, AIDS service organizations, hepatitis C organizations, patient advocacy organizations. And a lot of times it wasn't just, having advisory boards, it was going to, church fairs, health fairs, going, where the communities were going to gain feedback and really kind of create awareness and outreach. So I agree with that, and hearing what they have to say.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a great point to segue into our next question. Thank you to Carrie for submitting this. Can you share some experiences and recommendations for better serving the rural and indigenous communities in the U.S.? Great question.
Tricia, do you want to start or do you want me to start? It's tough, right?
I could think of one.
Yeah, go ahead, and then I've got some ideas.
I'll go then. So, yeah, I think it's really making sure you understand the patient communities, where they are, where they're at. One ultra rare disease I worked in was with the tribal health. So also making to understand, I think there was 574 federally recognized tribes, also making sure I knew what the process was when dealing with the tribe, going to the tribe, making sure I was fluent in some of the customs. What are the services that the tribal offers to their constituents as well? So making sure their needs were met from this ultra rare disease perspective, but in a meaningful and a very applicable to what their lifestyle is as well, and their cultural beliefs. So really, that's something that is, you have to kind of learn, and it takes some time to build that trust that we were talking about as well.
Yeah, I think it's not realistic to think that a company will build long-term relationships in Appalachia or the Bayou area of Louisiana or on the Navajo reservation. I think that's really, really hard. But what can happen is work with people who are working there. So those places, every rural community, every impoverished community has people who are working in that community addressing health issues, and it may be tied to a public health clinic. It may be tied to a foundation-run program. So partnering with those people, if you aren't going to invest 5 years to be present in that location and build trusted relationships, then tie to the people who do have the trusted relationships, listen to them, hear what they need, find a way to collaborate together. I think, but it has to be genuine. It has to be real. It has to be about listening and not just asking for things.
Thank you so much to both of you. Great perspectives. Question from TJ. And TJ, thank you for sharing that link in the chat with the attendees as well. We appreciate that. I think this is more of a comment, but I welcome our panelists' thoughts. Why do we as an industry, why do we feel as an industry that things are too far out of reach? We all know that diversity isn't just a problem, it's an opportunity to make medicines better for all. And every time we set the bar low so we can reach it, we stifle to reach this achievement. Any thoughts or comments from the panelists on that comment?
So I've got to speak to this first because I see this question, I think, came from TJ as well. And hi TJ. I haven't talked to TJ in ages, so it's great to see your name up here again. I think I'm so tempted to launch into a story here, but we don't have time for that. Sometimes you have to choose between what can you do now and what do you want to get to. And I think both are important. If you have a vision for where you want things to go, then each step takes you closer to that vision. Sometimes if you put the vision out there, you disconnect. It's like the old horses pulling the buggy, right? If you get the horses too far down the line, they're not pulling the buggy anymore. You've got to stay close enough to be connected and take people down a path that you see that they can go down. I think that kind of, I think that challenging vision, that revolutionary vision, about things that would upset and turn things inside out and upside down is important. How you articulate it, where you articulate it, I think has to be done carefully. But beyond that, you can take these individual steps that take you closer to that vision. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I've talked in circles a little bit here. I'm a big one for big revolutionary change, but I also need to be grounded in reality to think, what can you accomplish now without just disconnecting from everybody?
No, I agree, and I think things take time. And sadly, you know, it's not, things don't go as quickly as we would like. So I think this is, you know, I don't want to say baby steps. We have to take one step at a time to move this forward. But the goal is to have it all inclusive as well and have the populations represented.
Yeah, and I'll just add that revolutionary change rarely happens. We think it does. You know, we look at it and say, oh, this happened and everything changed. But if you look behind the this that happened, there were 1,000 steps that led to that before it built up the pressure to the point where things were forced to change. There's a great book written, gosh, now in the, I think in the 70s, about the theory of scientific revolution, I think was the name of it, that talked about how science changes, and it doesn't change because there's, you know, you learn this and you learn this and you learn this. No, people have their biases and their mindsets, but data grows up that says that this perspective is no longer true, and everybody dismisses it and says it's ridiculous, we can't do that, that's not right. But it builds up finally to the point that it has to boom, take a big leap forward. And I think that's what we're talking about. Let's build up those little steps that'll force things forward in big steps later on.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely makes sense. Thank you. Two more questions to get through. How do you evaluate if a company has a real commitment to resolving this issue or simply window dressing because of optics? Does this affect who you will work with?
Tricia, do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I mean, who I'm working with is really the patients and the patient organizations. So to me, that's the need. So I'm constantly going to the patients and making sure that we're being as represented and taking the message of the patients to the company, up to the CEO, and making sure the message and the patient's voice is heard. So I think continuing to do that is paramount. That's my job.
Yeah, I wish Andrea were here for the Q&A piece. She wasn't able to join us for this, but she's the one who talked about meeting a chief patient officer who had not, in a year and a half on the job, had not met with a single patient, right? So that's a very stark example about a position and a title that is not really resolving the situation. I think if a company has a real commitment, it comes from the top down, and it's part of, it's baked into the culture, it's baked into the understanding. You almost don't have to think about it, though you should think about it. Mm-hmm. There's a culture of self-correction, there's a culture of reflection and evaluation, and yeah, I think it's easier to feel on the inside. I think it's easier to see on the inside of a company whether the company is really bought into it or not. Companies, if they're smart, can do the window dressing pretty well, and maybe that's okay. But if you're working with communities that have been suspicious and are cautious, they'll see the tells. They'll know whether it's real or not. I think about a person who went into a patient advocacy role at a major company, and at one point said, you know, there was a new role for this person. They'd not done advocacy before, but at one point they said, we give these patient advocacy groups money. Why can't they just do what we asked them to do, right? So they had the role, they had the title, but they didn't get it. Now, this person, very much to their credit, a year later had been exposed to enough patient advocacy and had learned enough that they had a very, very different attitude. But that kind of attitude does come across, and you can see it. You can see whether it's genuine or real or not. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Interesting story.
Yes, absolutely. Would love to have a case study with them to hear the progression throughout that.
Yeah.
Last question for our panelists here. How do you see the medical affairs clinical trials groups working with patients in research and development? Often pharma is about marketing and that is late in the process. Is there a way to get patients and caregivers involved before phase 1?
Oh, I'll start with this, and Tricia, you can build on it. Absolutely, absolutely. I think one of the great questions we love talking to patients about when we do ad boards and things like this, and we'll do a lot of ad boards around patient experience mapping and really trying to understand the patient perspective, protocol review, all those things. But one of the questions we always love to ask is, what would a new drug have to do in order for the patient community to get excited about it? This is a question that can be asked before phase 1. So you really understand what the patient community needs. And I know one company, a small company, that asked that question before they went into phase 1. They listened to what the patients had to say, they listened to their life experience, and they said, you know what? The candidate we were looking at will not give them what they need. And they decided not to go into that space. And I think that was exactly the right decision. I love the idea of talking to people preclinical before you go into the phase 1 study to make sure that what you're doing has the ability to address an unmet patient need. Tricia?
No, I totally agree, Tim. Early stage patient advocacy engagement is key. And I think you said it as well, but doing a needs assessment in terms of what are the needs of the patients, what are the gaps that they're currently understanding, not just patients, but caregivers as well, because that is a component that will help develop, a drug, a protocol design that will work. Having the patient groups, if there is one, look, help create what the parameters are. Do these endpoints make sense? The protocol design, does that make sense? What is the burden of the trial? The visit sites, what does that look like? So a lot of this is something really taking into account from medical affairs with clinical trials, making sure we can take the patient's voice, pre and get it through the process of the clinical trial. It's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much to you two. Any final thoughts before I wrap up today? Very robust discussion.
No, I just think I'm excited to see where this can go. And I am more hopeful now that I've been in a long, long time that we can see genuine progress in this area. So I applaud everyone for listening and for the commitments you're going to make those small steps and set those big visions in the future.
Lovely.
Thanks.
Lovely. Well, Tricia, absolutely a pleasure, and thank you for being here for the Q&A as well. We know you're busy. Tricia Mullins, Global Head Patient Advocacy at Atara Biotherapeutics. Truly cannot thank our sponsor for today enough, VAZ Advisors, specifically Dr. Tim Turum, Vice President of Client Services, for putting together today's panel. Truly robust discussion. I think we all enjoyed it, and thank you to our attendees for investing your time with us. We do hope you found this helpful. I know if you had to jump off early, so I will be in touch with a copy of the recording, but big thank you again to today's sponsors, VAZ Advisors. We truly appreciate this robust discussion. And again, any further questions or comments for us, please don't hesitate to reach out. I can be reached directly at webinars@q1productions.com. Thank you again, everyone. Be safe and be well. Have a great day.
Thank you, Brooke. Bye.
Bye.